I like to throw out, if you're both okay with a little bit of extra time, we'll keep rolling for a second, because I like to throw out like an extra question, sometimes involving like a creative process, just to get people's takes on like how they do things. So I think this has actually worked out pretty well, because my question for today, and I posted it on Instagram, I guess yesterday at this point, was how do you revise? So that was just a question on my mind this past week for a couple of different reasons, but just the idea of, okay, we got creating, and that was probably one of my questions in a previous session, like, okay, how do you get your ideas? How do you start? I think was my last one. But then also, that's the other side of the coin. How do you cut? How do you change? How do you revise, edit? So I had a couple of responses which I can share from the Instagram crew, but maybe somebody can offer a thought. If you got a process, a practice, a method. I'll maintain that it's not a formula. I'm not a formulaic kind of writing person or editor, but there are tricks, there are patterns, there are things that work more times than not. So how do you revise? And I'll look up my my Instagram responses.
So for me, it really depends on whether I'm writing poetry or prose, and if it's prose, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. Because for poetry, I tend to not revise nearly as much as I do with prose. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of my poetry is written on the spot and as a response or a reaction to things that happen. I once, when I was 16, I wrote a poem that is now published in the Unoya Review. I wrote the first few lines at my mother's funeral, and I didn't really want to revise that much because that's what like made it so raw, the fact that I wrote it on the spot at my mother's funeral. So in general for poetry, I try not to revise too much because I think that can sometimes take away from the realness and the rawness of poetry. But for fiction, I also write novels and short stories and essays. My favorite trick, and I saw quite a few people say this on Instagram, and I hear this all the time, but I think it's said often for a good reason, is I like to put it away and go back to it later and try to look at it with an objective point of view, almost as though I didn't even write it. Because I'm an editor at Beyond Queer Words, so I read writing every day, and I can pretty quickly sense whether or not I'm going to vote yes or no in whether it's going to be accepted at the magazine. So when I'm working on something, I like to put it away for a while and pretend that some total stranger wrote it and that it's a submission for a magazine. So that way I can really put my bias aside and really focus on what I can do to make it better. I also like to make sure that when I do make revisions that I'm still being true to myself, whether it be fiction or nonfiction, because there's this temptation, especially in modern days, to write what you believe will be successful or what will sell commercially. But I think it's important to kind of stick to yourself even when you are making changes. So yeah, in general, I try to limit my revisions, but obviously it's necessary, especially for longer projects like a novel. But yeah, I think that's my main thing, putting it aside for as long as possible and pretending you didn't even write it, which sounds strange, but it's worked for me.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So yeah, a couple people said something along those lines. I'll try to get it accurate, so I give them credit. But I think that's one of those methods, is let it sit somewhere else. You're not engaging with it directly, but the ideas or the inspiration or the concepts, they're rolling around, they're steeping. And then when you do go back to it, the thing hasn't changed, but your ideas about it have maybe shifted a bit. So that's, that's one thing. So that's great. And then the second thing I'll say is light touch. So that's, I say that if I'm working with somebody specifically, my approach, if I'm working with somebody else, is I would rather have a light touch. You're the one who has the experience and the idea and where it's coming from and all that stuff that I don't have access to. So you're the one who's expressing it. And I want to learn about what you're trying to express, and then get to the accurate way, that you want to represent it. So I think that's, there is something to that where you don't want to change too much when you're onto something. I guess that's when when you're onto something, and when you're just trying to slog through something. So thanks for that. I'll read a couple that I had from Instagram. One of them, friend of Wild Roof Journal, we'll get this one out of the way. Rachel, she said, already, I just write the first draft all bad like, and then I make you read it, meaning me. So yeah, very funny. And then she has a maniacal laughter after that. So yes, I know. But serious point to that little joke. Showing somebody that you trust, showing somebody that's willing to engage. We probably all have tried to give our writing to somebody who doesn't really want to deal with it. It's like, read this for me. And then they like, yeah, did you read it? Like, no. But having that back and forth, and I'll say I gave her stuff that I wrote that she gave me commentary on. So it goes both ways.